To get a high score in IELTS, well, a band 7, 8 or 9 that is, you're told you need to use complex structures in your writing. But it's difficult to know exactly what a complex structure is. In today's video, we aim to simplify that by showing you certain words that you can put into your essays. And by using these words, you're automatically writing complex structures. Let's get straight into it. Welcome, my name is Eli, and today we're looking at certain words that automatically mean that we're using complex sentence structures in our writing. Well, let's get straight into those words. So, the first set of words are although, even though, despite, in spite of, and while. And we've joined these words together because they suggest a contrast, and you'll see what we mean when we look through some examples. We also have because, due to, as, and since, and these words usually suggest a reason. Further, we have in order to and so that, and these words suggest a purpose. And finally, we have instead of, which is a way of showing an alternative. Now, what we're going to do is go through all of these words, show you some example sentences, and how we form the sentences that these words appear in. So let's start with the contrasting words. Especially we're going to start with although and even though, which we can use interchangeably. Let's look at some example sentences. Although, or even though, studying abroad is more expensive, millions of young people choose to do this every year. Millions of young people choose to study abroad every year, although it is very expensive, or even though it is very expensive. Okay, so we've seen two sentences that we can use with although and even though. Let's have a look at the form. Well, first of all, we use although or even though, and then a subject and then a verb. So when we have a subject and verb, we often call this a clause. So if we look at the first sentence, we have although, even though, studying abroad is more expensive. So studying abroad is the subject and is the verb. So studying abroad is more expensive is a clause. So we have although, even though, and then a clause. Now, when we have although or even though at the start of a sentence, we need to use a comma, and we can see this in sentence number 1. It says, although studying abroad is more expensive, comma, millions of young people choose to do this every year. Now, if the sentence does not start with although or even though, then we don't need a comma. So if we look at sentence number 2, there is no comma. It's millions of young people choose to study abroad every year, although it is very expensive. We don't need a comma here. So simply by using although or even though in one of these sentence structures, you're using an advanced structure that will get you a higher score in your IELTS writing. What other words are there? Well, despite and in spite of. So, millions of young people choose to study abroad every year despite high tuition fees, or in spite of high tuition fees. Both are acceptable. Despite the fact that, or in spite of the fact that, university education abroad is more expensive, millions of young people choose to do this every year. Now we have a third sentence. Despite or in spite of being more expensive, millions of young people choose to study abroad every year. Sorry about that. I just had an oatcake and I think it's stuck in my throat. Let's continue. So let's look at the form. In spite of or despite plus a noun. So that's what we see in sentence number 1. Millions of young people choose to study abroad every year despite high tuition fees, or in spite of high tuition fees. Second rule, in spite of, despite, and then the fact that means that we should have a subject and a verb, which is a clause, afterwards. So we can see that in sentence number 2. Despite the fact that, or in spite of the fact that, university education abroad is more expensive. And then the second clause. So here the subject is university education abroad and the verb is. Okay, we can also have in spite of or despite plus an ing verb, and that's what we see in sentence number 3. Despite being more expensive, or in spite of being more expensive. Okay, we also use commas when we start with these words. So we can see that in sentence number 2 and sentence number 3. Do you see the commas in these two sentences? There they are. Okay, the next word, while. And this is very useful for academic task 2. International student fees have increased while domestic student fees have declined. While domestic student fees have declined, international student fees have increased. So how do we form sentences with while? Well, we usually have while and then a subject and a verb, which is a clause. And we can see this in sentence number 1 and sentence number 2. So in sentence number 1, the subject is domestic student fees and the verb is have. And likewise in sentence number 2. We use a comma if while is at the beginning of the sentence. So we can see that in sentence number 2. If while is in the middle of a sentence, we sometimes put a comma, but it depends on the meaning. So we put a comma when it is used to introduce a contrast. For example, I like Coke while my sister likes Pepsi. So here while is a bit like nevertheless or however. However, we don't use a comma when while means at the same time as. So for example, I was drinking Coke while my sister was buying Pepsi. Now, in our example, in sentence number 1, it's not clear whether while means nevertheless or however or at the same time as. So when it's not clear, it's better to put the comma in. Okay, we're now looking at some words to do with giving a reason. And the first one is a very common word that you'll be using all the time, but I bet you didn't know it means that you're actually using advanced grammar, well, in the eyes of IDP and the British Council and your examiner. And that word is because. Tuition fees are higher for international students because they are willing to pay higher rates. We can also have that at the beginning of the sentence. Because of the price of studying abroad, many students can't afford to go. So, the form. Well, we have because plus the subject and then a verb, as in sentence number 1, or because of and then a noun or an ing verb, as in sentence number 2. And like the others, we have a comma if because is at the beginning of the sentence, which we can see in sentence number 2. Now, even though because is advanced grammar, used in this way that is, it's still a very common word and it won't really impress the examiner much. It's better to use some of these other words that we can also use to convey a reason. How about due to? Tuition fees are higher for international students due to the fact that they are willing to pay higher rates. Due to the price of studying abroad, many students can't afford to go. Let's look at the form. We use due to the fact that, and then a subject, and then a verb. That's a clause, remember? We can see that in sentence number 1. We use due to plus a noun or an ing verb, and we can see that in sentence number 2. And then we have a comma when due to, or due to the fact that, is at the beginning of the sentence. Okay? We can also use as or since, and this also gives a reason. Many students choose to live at home as or since rent is so expensive. As universities abroad are more expensive, many students choose to study domestically. Or, since universities are more expensive, many students choose to study domestically. So how do we form these? Well, again, we have as or since plus the subject and a verb. And we use comma if as or since is at the beginning of the sentence. Okay. We're now going to come to the final part, which is purpose, and we're going to focus on in order to. So we can say, students go to universities abroad in order to receive a better education. So in order to shows the reason why students go abroad to study. We can also say, in order to receive a better education, students go to universities abroad. What about the form? We use in order to plus the infinitive. So in sentence number 1, we can see in order to receive a better education. And in sentence number 2, in order to receive a better education. We use a comma if in order to is at the beginning of the sentence. Again, we can see that in sentence number 2. Okay, what about so that? Another very useful phrase or set of words that automatically mean that we're using advanced grammar in our essays. Parents save up money so that their children are able to study abroad. So that their children are able to study abroad, parents have to save up a lot of money. Okay, let's focus on the form. Well, we have so that plus a subject and a verb, a clause. And we can see that in sentence number 1 and sentence number 2. And we use a comma if so that is at the beginning of a sentence, but not if it's in the middle of a sentence, which we can see in sentence number 1. There is no comma, and in sentence number 2, there is a comma. Okay, finally, the final word that we're going to cover today is instead of. Many students are choosing to study abroad instead of at home. Instead of staying in their home country, many students choose to go abroad to study. Let's look at the form. We use instead of plus a noun, instead of plus an ing verb, which we can see in sentence number 2. And again, if instead of is at the beginning of a sentence, then we need a comma. Right, now what I suggest is, if any of that wasn't clear, watch the first half of this video or up until this point again, because now we have a surprise quiz. Okay, question number 1. Video conferencing software is very powerful for business meetings. We need a word here, often leading to breakdowns in communication. Now, I'm going to give you 2 options. We have either despite or although. Now what you can do is pause the video now, have a think, choose which answer you think it fits into this space, and then we're going to go through the answers together. Okay, the answer to number 1 is despite. So we use despite plus an ing verb or a noun. So we say despite often leading to breakdowns in communication. We cannot put although here because although is followed by a subject and then a verb. So if we wanted to put although here, we would have to say, although it often leads to breakdowns in communication. So the meaning between these 2 sentences is the same, but the structure is different. Now, in order to get those high marks for grammatical range and accuracy, you need to have the structure right. So it's very important to know whether you need an ing verb, a noun, or maybe a clause following the word. Let's have a look at another example. Here's the sentence, and here are the 2 options. Again, feel free to pause the video. We'll go through the answers together. Okay. The answer is although. Remember, we have although plus a subject and a verb, and that's what we see here. So the subject is using video conferencing software, and the verb is can. If we want to use despite, we need an ing verb or a noun. So despite causing breakdowns in communication. Again, the structure is important. Let's have a look at the next one. Something, the fees are much more expensive. Many students still choose to study abroad. And our two options are even though and in spite of. Right, pause the video. The answer is even though. So we use even though and then a subject and then a verb. But we use in spite of plus an ing verb or a noun. So we could say even though the fees are much more expensive, or in spite of expensive fees. So the meaning is the same, but we need to be careful about how we structure the sentence. Okay. Next question. Something decrease the amount of carbon emissions. The government should restrict the number of cars that each household can own. Our two options, so that and in order to. What is the correct answer? In order to. We use in order to and then an infinitive, and that's what we see here. In order to decrease the amount of carbon emissions. But we use so that with a subject and a verb. So we could say, so that the amount of carbon emissions are decreased. Do you see how it means the same thing, but the way that we form the sentence is different depending on the word that we choose? Okay, something, the fees are much more expensive. Many students still choose to study abroad. In spite of or in spite of the fact that. Okay, what can you remember from this video so far? When do we use in spite of and when do we use in spite of the fact that? Well, in this case, we use in spite of the fact that. We use in spite of the fact that when we have a subject and then a verb afterwards. But we use in spite of when we have an ing verb or a noun. So we can say in spite of more expensive fees, or in spite of the fact that the fees are much more expensive. Okay, two more to go. Something, university education is so expensive, many students have to take out large loans and end up graduating with a large amount of debt. Number one, because. Number two, because of. What's the correct answer? The correct answer is because. So we use because plus a subject, a verb, and because of plus an ing verb or a noun. So if we want to use because of, we would say because of university education being so expensive. Okay. Something, the price of studying abroad, many students can't afford to go. Due to or due to the fact that? What would you put? Due to. Due to plus a noun or an ing verb, due to the fact that, plus a subject and then a verb. Okay, the final question. Can you get it right? Many students choose to study abroad, something staying in their home country. Is it instead of or in order to? Which one makes more sense? I feel like you've got an easy last question. The answer is instead of. Okay, instead of plus a noun or an ing verb, and in order to plus an infinitive. So we could say in order to leave their home country instead of staying in their home country. Okay, I realize this is quite a complex video, even though the words themselves are quite simple. A good idea is to practice using all of these words in your practice essays, getting familiar with them, experimenting with them ultimately, and then when it comes to writing your essay in the exam, you'll be able to replicate these sentence structures with a lot more confidence. and hopefully a lot more accuracy. Best of luck with your studies, and I'll see you next time. Bye then.